I found myself deeply emotional at the experiences of baptism for all my three children for different reasons. But particularly the moment of deepest grace for me was when our pastor approached us in the first few moments of being in the church and asked my husband and I, "What do you ask for your child?" This is the moment where we get to present our children to the church as God's own beloved child, just like Christ was at his baptism. This is my child with whom I'm very well pleased. And it is the responsibility of that church in the moment to embrace and welcome and delight in that child in the same way.
Welcome to Preach, a podcast from American Media on the art of Catholic preaching. I'm your host, Ricardo da Silva, a Jesuit priest from South Africa, associate editor at American Media, and also an associate pastor at the Church of St. Francis Xavier in New York City. It's so good to be back with you in this new season of Preach. Now, as you know, we're moving away from our usual format of Sunday to Sunday preaching that you've become so used to on this podcast. And this season, we're really focused on the sacraments and how to preach for the sacraments. So in this new season, we're going to take each sacrament in two parts, sometimes over multiple episodes. In the first section of exploring a sacrament and preaching for that sacrament, we're going to speak with liturgists, catechetical directors, pastoral professionals about their experience of the sacrament and what they've heard from pastors preaching those sacraments. And then we'll actually hear the homilies that you've so come to love, a homily on a particular sacrament. And from there, we'll have a conversation with that preacher about how they conceived their homily. So to do this, we're going to start with the fundamental sacrament, the one that we're all invited to receive right at the very beginning of our lives, baptism. And my guest today is Christina Mines. Christina, welcome to Preach.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. It's nice to be here with you.
Now, Christina, you're the director of Evangelization and Catechesis for the Diocese of Hamilton in Ontario, Canada.
As our bishop likes to call it, the great and glorious Diocese of Hamilton.
Now, for those of us here in the US, situate us. Where are we exactly in Canada?
Certainly. We're about an hour west of Toronto, right in the heart of the Greater Toronto area in Ontario, surrounded by Lake Ontario. It's a beautiful little city, but one of the larger dioceses in Canada.
And so you're the director of Catechesis there and Evangelization, but you have another very important job. You're also a mum of three. Tell us a little bit about your family and your experience of faith in your family.
Certainly. So my husband, Robert, and I have been married for 12 years, and we have three children, Nathaniel, who's 10, Josephine, who's 8, and Levi, who's 5. Rob and I both grew up in the same parish. We met doing youth ministry at our parish, and now we raise our children there. And so it's a beautiful opportunity for us to be surrounded by our own families. My mom and his mom are still actively engaged in our parish life there. And for us to now grow new memories with our growing family as well.
Wonderful. Well, I'm so looking forward to speaking with you, not only because you have the experience as a professional, a pastoral professional, but also because you have this very grounded experience of being a mum who's gone through baptism with all three of her children, I presume.
Yes, and one during COVID. So it's certainly a different experience of celebrating the sacrament when you're in isolation. So I do have a heart and some empathy for families who come to us who have missed the opportunity for baptism due to their experiences of isolation during COVID.
Well, we're together there because I was ordained the summer of 2019 in South Africa before moving to the US as a deacon. And so the first sacrament that I had the opportunity to celebrate, to preside at, was the sacrament of baptism in COVID conditions with godparents on Zoom cameras.
Oh, no. Well, certainly the pictures on the wall look a little funny with all of us in masks around the baptismal font, but we still treasure them deeply because it's an important moment in our family's history. And we try to forget about all of the particular requirements that were needed of us to make that celebration happen.
I'm going to throw you right into the deep end as a mom. What is it that you remember most about your children's baptisms, and particularly in terms of the celebration of the sacrament itself?
Certainly. Well, my two oldest children have now celebrated baptism and their first reconciliation, first Eucharist. And our youngest, Levi, looks forward to celebrating the sacraments of reconciliation and Eucharist in a couple of years. But I found myself deeply emotional at the experiences of baptism for all my three children for different reasons. But particularly the moment of deepest grace for me wasn't necessarily when the water was poured with the words said at the font. It was when our pastor approached us in the first few moments of being in the church and asked my husband and I, "What do you ask for your child?" Those first words, "What do you wish for your child?" really did stir for me this promise of hope and an embrace of belonging for this beautiful new baby who I had grown to love and was challenged by and was delighted by in each and every moment of the day. I actually just got back in my professional career from a service learning experience in Guatemala. So I was in Guatemala with educators here in our diocese for 9 days, working in schools. And on one of our first few days in Guatemala, I had the opportunity to visit a rural village called Tioche up in the mountains, about 3 hours outside of Antigua, Guatemala. And we spent the day playing with children, getting to know them, learning a lot of Spanish along the way, and really just embracing the heart of these children through play-based learning. And at the end of the day, we got to sit down with the community and with the parents of the community. And a father looked at me at the end of our time and he said, "Thank you for taking the time to get to know the heart of my child." And I think at the moment of baptism, really, God is looking at the community to say those exact words. "Thank you for taking the time to get to know the heart of my child," right? This is the moment where we get to present our children to the church as God's own beloved child, just like Christ was at his baptism. "This is my child with whom I'm very well pleased." And it is the responsibility of that church in the moment to embrace and welcome and delight in that child in the same way.
Christina, I think our listeners might think that we've rehearsed this conversation, but we've never spoken before. And, one of the things that I remember when I was first about to celebrate a baptism, and I was incredibly nervous. I can't tell you how nervous I was. But I remember a dear priest friend of mine at that time who lived with me in the community. He said to me, "Just think of those words in the scripture." And of course, one of the most popular scriptures we have for preaching on baptisms is, "This is my son, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased." And this voice comes from the cloud above over Jesus in the waters being baptized by John the Baptist in the Jordan. And he said, that's the key message. That's what you want this family to leave with by the end of the sacrament. And I must say, it shapes every single homily that I have given at a baptism. Sometimes I actually walk up to the child and I look at the child and I say, "This is my daughter, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased." And I invite the parents to do the same and the godparents. And then I invite people to think about, for themselves, what does that mean? When you hear that spoken of you, how does that change the way you approach the sacrament, your life, to know that you are loved, that you are cherished, that you are beloved, that you are chosen? And just hearing what you've said, it brings that to life so much, and how important that is for parents to hear. Because let's think about it. The people who are coming to the sacrament, many of them, especially now, have a very different experience of church, perhaps, than some of the older preachers preaching in these sacraments, where they had communities who were faithful week to week, knew the sacraments, had almost a Baltimore catechism, like they knew their stuff. That's not who's coming today.
No, and certainly not in our diocese. We see a wide diversity of people who are coming forward for the sacraments, and the ways in which we approach that moment of preaching, or the way in which we approach that moment of engagement or for a family, can make it or break it for people who have been away from the faith. There is a consistent trend in our diocese of increase both in infant baptism and the phenomenon that's been born from COVID in baptisms of 1 to 7-year-olds. So children who have an understanding of what they're experiencing and who are asked to engage in a really special way in the celebration of their first sacrament of initiation. But the people coming to the church, the parents of these children are coming in throes. Our numbers continue to rise. And so what we do know about this parenting generation is that baptism means something to them. These families are looking for belonging, but that is coupled with the tension of a generation of baptized millennial parents. So on average, our parenting ages are, around 29, 30 years old to mid 40s, because folks in our diocese are having children and families later on in life, with an interesting relationship with the church. We have publicly funded Catholic schools here in the Diocese of Hamilton, and for many, their engagement, their regular ritual engagement with the church, ended with the end of Catholic school in grade 12. So for some, over 20 years ago, 2 decades ago. And that means a distance from the sacraments and the life of their parish community. So what they know of what it means to be church, what it means to be Catholic, comes from their muscle memory, either good or bad, their own grace history with their experience of parish. It also comes from the news. It comes from cultural representations of what it means to be church. It comes from the media, and they have opinions. They have influence. They have platforms for communication that are available at their fingertips, and a way of existing that demands that they ask questions of their church and what it means to belong. So that message that you talked about, Ricardo, you are deeply loved. You are my child with whom I'm very well pleased. Sometimes that echoes even deeper for the parents than it does for the child that we pray will receive that grace, that beautiful grace of the sacrament. And I think back to even Pope Francis's work in Christus Vivit, the Apostolic Exhortation Christus Vivit, way back in 2018. And at that time, I was the director of youth ministry for this diocese. And I had the privilege of sitting in conversation with young people and young adults who didn't necessarily have a language for it yet, but they knew that what they were searching for, that belonging, was to know that they were deeply loved. And they may not have a relationship with God or even a language to be able to understand that the love they were looking for was that boundless, endless, reckless love of God. But they were able to articulate that that was the deepest longing of their soul. I think what's really beautiful, but also challenging about this parenting generation is that that's what they're looking for. They are looking deeply for more.
Mm. So this looking deeply for more, obviously you're speaking from the perspective of what's going on in Hamilton, a process of baptismal formation throughout the diocese, which I'd love to hear more about. But what is it that you think facilitates that formation at depth about baptism that so many are searching for?
So beginning in this new pastoral year, we are going to be inviting baptismal preparation leaders in our diocese to begin to explore deeply their role of leadership, but also of accompaniment of a generation that is looking for that more. And it has been informed a lot by the work of the Dynamic Catholic Institute and the Catholic Leadership Institute in the United States. So we previously had a partnership with the Good Shepherd's Good Leaders, and our pastors were formed under that model. And so we have access to a lot of their data and research, and they just released a wonderful document called Reaching, Engaging, and Inspiring the Next Generation. And what it does is it really breaks down for us the characteristics of millennial people and the challenges and barriers to their ongoing faith formation engagement with parish life. It's a difficult generation because they're seeking authentic witness to be able to answer their questions of meaning and value in their faith, but also provide the why of staying engaged, or the calling and the invitation, responding to the call and invitation to stay engaged with the parish post-sacrament in their family. The questions are, what might the church be able to give me that no one else can? And the question that's asked in this research is, how does the Catholic Church create a space for millennials from that demand, from that need to belong? And the challenges are complex. And we want our baptismal preparation leaders to not only be aware of them, but then to be emboldened to respond from that understanding. So what does it mean to be able to provide families with baptismal preparation that is comprehensive and thorough and life-giving when we have challenges of, economic crises and families needing to work and not be able to make in-person conversations or preparation sessions, when we have experiences of anxiety or hesitation in large group settings to be able to share faith? How do we create a place where we have small group accompaniment models so that families feel like they belong, but are also seen from their individuality and their giftedness? How do we respond to the challenge of millennials living with the scandals in the church and the doubt that they have about the goodness of God due to the human frailty and complexity of who we are as church? These are all conversations that are necessary for us to ensure that we're not only providing programming, but we're providing really effective pastoral care for the families who are coming forward for this preparation. This really is the first entrance way back for them to come home. This really is, for us as a church, hope finally coming home.
So let's talk about that coming home, right? I mean, in many cases, these are people who are coming back to the church after COVID. In many cases, these are people who are coming back to the church at all, who are finding the church. We know that there's a new interest in Catholicism, especially in highly secularized countries. So there's a whole gamut of people at various stages in their faith life coming into the church. My experience, and I think this is an important one for us to interrogate a little, is the first thing that we ask parents and godparents to do for baptism is to attend some kind of formation or preparation. And I must confess, one of the most discouraging things for me as a pastor is when I stand up there and I say, what do you ask of the church for your child? And then I have to mime, baptism. And then baptism, which, sometimes suggests to me that that formation process that happens beforehand, which is usually just a morning or a couple of hours, is a little incomplete. Most of those sessions are an introduction to the liturgy. It's like a dress rehearsal. This is what the priest's going to say. This is what we're going to ask you to say. There's a little bit of theological formation maybe about what baptism is. But tell me, what do you think we can, as pastors and pastoral directors, do to bring about that experience in a fuller way that actually then brings them into the sacrament itself, the celebration of the sacrament itself, more meaningfully.
And I think what you're talking about, Ricardo, is developing a confidence to engage, right? We want parents and godparents to enter into the sacrament ready to participate fully, aware of the signs and symbols, and to experience the richness of the liturgy in its fullness through their participation. But to allow people to enter into that freely without hesitation or the feel of requirement on them, we need to focus on personal encounter before preparation. I have learned so much from some of our more senior pastors in the diocese, particularly those that have been in ministry for at least 30 or 40 years, and how they have walked with families through both the joys and the challenges. A few years back, I was having lunch at a parish after an experience of Vacation Bible School, and I was sitting with the pastor, and I said to him, do you know many of these families who are here for Vacation Bible School, Father, because the ages 3 to 5 that are usually coming through for Vacation Bible School. And he said, oh, absolutely. So-and-so's dad works at the steel factory downtown, and so-and-so's mom is a nurse on shift. And, so-and-so, they lost their grandmother a couple of years ago, and that's been a real struggle. And I said to him, Father, this is such a busy, vibrant parish. How do you keep it all straight? And he said to me, and this has stuck with me, he said, I start from day one. And from the moment the child is born, he makes an effort to visit the families once they're out of the hospital, once babe is home, once everyone is feeling settled. He goes, he puts on the tea kettle, and he sits with them. He hears of their joys and struggles. He asks how he can be of assistance, how he can serve them from his own experience of ministry, from his own Christ-like posture. And he asks how the community can find a way to wrap their arms around them and help them in the journey of faith. I think when families come forward for baptismal preparation, they have so many assumptions about what it ought to look like or what might be expected from them. Can the church and can we, as the lay faithful and the priests and religious who help out in this vibrant work of accompaniment of families towards baptism, can we imagine a preparation plan that looks more like relationship development and less like work? And I think that means for us feeling confident enough to throw away the programs and recognize that meeting people in their humanity is enough as a starting point.
I love this idea about relationship, right? Because it's so important. I often think, for example, the couples that we prepare for marriage that I don't see again. If I invited them to a cocktail party a couple of months later and said, hey, what's the experience been like? Hey, meet each other. That might generate more relationship and relatability between people and their pastor as well. Let's look at that relationship question, though, in a highly globalized, secularized, fast-paced world. It's pretty easy, I think, for a pastor of a small parish to visit every young baby born at home and, nurture families. It's a little more difficult in a metropolitan like New York City, where we have thousands of families, and that's just untenable.
Certainly.
This year alone, I think I've celebrated over 40 baptisms. And I'm a part-time assistant pastor.
Right.
So maybe before we move to the break, tell me, how do you think that the community plays a role here beyond simply the pastor? And how can we help as a community? Because, of course, that's the whole point of a child being baptized in the Catholic Church in the context of a community, is that we promise as a community to offer that support.
Yes.
So how do we do that for baptism?
There's a lovely book that was written by an archbishop here in Canada. His name is Paul-André Durocher. I'm not sure if you've heard of him, Ricardo, but he wrote a book recently called Called in His Name and Sent in His Name. And it's a conversation on discipleship, but what's really lovely is it has meditations on each of the sacraments of initiation within it. And in it, he reflects on Jesus's baptism as the revelation of intimacy between God the Son and God the Father, and the relationship grounded every aspect of Jesus's life, right? Baptism revealed his true name and identity as the child of God. And the same is true for each and every one of us. But then I think in recognition of that title as priest, prophet, king, as child and beloved of God, we're called into a family of God that is meant to walk each other home. And so how does that translate is your question, right? As a shot in the arm of encouragement for families, how do we embrace them in deep love and respect for their own domestic church, but then how they can contribute to the body of Christ as community? And it's uncomfortable. My answer is uncomfortable because I think it starts with patience. Families are at different places and stages. And the conversation about belonging must be kept open and reciprocal for the church to remain relevant for the family. I am a mom of a 10-year-old with special needs, and he's not always welcome in the same way at our parish that we've belonged at our whole entire life as everyone else. And these young people who are bringing their family bravely into the doors of the church on Sunday, they are living that life in a complex way, yes, but in a holy way. Their daily labor is holy, and that needs to be recognized and celebrated. How can that be done maybe in the liturgy? How can we be praying for our families in the petitions on Sunday? How can we be offering a diversity of places and spaces for families to feel, particularly those with unique challenges, like they belong? And I think it starts with hospitality and joy. Embrace and welcome will always require discomfort and inconvenience on the part of the parish, and that's essential. I loved Pope Francis's line when he said, he expects a mess. The church ought to be a mess. And I think that echoes back to that old adage that if the church isn't crying, it's dying, right? So radical hospitality doesn't just mean on the day of baptism. It doesn't just mean that the doors are open early and families can take pictures and, there's a change room available for the babe, but every day before and after that. And it's going to require a village of support around a pastor who, like you've said, is already overextended and overstretched. But I think that that's a good news story because the pastor isn't the face of the parish, right? He is the shepherd of the parish. It is the responsibility and the duty of the rest of the sons and daughters of God to be able to take up that torch and say, welcome, you belong, you matter here.
Memory is such an important part, I think, of our faith. Sort of, the experiences we remember. So I want to ask you, can you tell a story or of an experience of this kind of welcome, even radical welcome, that you've experienced around baptism from the stories that you've heard in your diocese or even from your own life? And maybe where it hasn't worked. Because, the idea behind this show, of course, is to give best pastoral practices, but also say, hey, don't do this. This doesn't help.
Yeah, I can share a story, I think, from my own family.
Sure.
I am an only child of a mother from Malaysia and a dad who's Welsh. Only child, and I married into what I think is probably the largest Irish Catholic family in Hamilton. But they have their own battle scars, as we all do, right? We walk around with our wounds. I love Father Gregory Boyle talking about, what develops kinship in community is our wounds, right? We all walk around with them. And my husband's family had a loss of a baby quite early in a marriage during birth, which affected the ways in which the children were received to the sacraments because there was such a fear and a disconnect from the parish. The mom and dad was only reminded of their child that they had lost by being in the church. And the physical act of being in the church was just so deeply wounding that the children, their beautiful daughters that they had afterwards, missed the opportunity to engage in the sacraments. And that was a challenge, but I can't imagine it's an isolated one. I think sometimes families miss the opportunity to come into the embrace of the sacraments due to pain, due to trauma, unresolved healing. And it really was the personal accompaniment of our associate pastor, Ricardo. So those associate pastors are incredible people who was able to meet the family in their humility and also their fear, recognize and name what they had been through, and then provide strategies and resource so that the children could be welcomed to the waters in a way that was healing for everyone involved, include the dignity of their child that they had lost, and celebrate this new complexity of family that really was a representation of the cross of Christ, but also of the hope of the resurrection too. Let me tell you another story about a family I met a couple summers back now. I was sitting at my office and my phone rang, and there was a lovely mom on the other side of the phone. She was studying theology in another part of the country, but recently had left our diocese to go and study. And she was married, and she had recently welcomed 2 adoptive children into her family. Faithful members of their parish in different ways, shapes, and forms. This woman and her partner approached their parish pastor for baptism for these children that they had welcomed into their family. The complication here being that this woman was in a same-sex relationship, and she was not only judged, but refused the graces of baptism for her children because of her relationship status. What's interesting about this situation is that she understood the teachings of the church. She knew that her children were called to the waters of the sacrament, and yet it was being denied them due to a personal opinion and a fear, but also a misconception of who they were as family. This mom and her partner were devastated by this and wondered if our diocese might be able to embrace them back home to be able to celebrate the sacrament. And with some very thorough conversations with a local pastor who actually knew this young woman as an undergraduate student, thanks be to God, they were welcomed back to Ontario with the delightful presence of their godparents and their own parents, the grandparents, to be able to welcome these children to the faith. But I think my problem or my frustration, even devastation, is that needed to even be an option for these women and their children. And that sometimes my fear is that due to misconception, uncertainty, or even our own bias, we hold the sacraments ransom for an ideology that is not the real experience of humanity alive and the church that God needs us to be for the world today.
I can't tell you how vexed, angry that makes me, not least obviously because this child was denied baptism, which is the child's right by being a creation of God, but because somebody who knew that her child deserved baptism because of that was denied it.
Yes.
But it also gives me a tremendous amount of hope because it shows that the church is not the preserve of the pastor or the bishop, right? It belongs to us all. And somebody who has been well formed, somebody who probably had a good experience of church herself, trusted enough in that she said, no,
Yes.
I'm not going to accept this, and I'm going to seek baptism for my child in the Roman Catholic Church. And I'm not going to be discouraged by this one experience and leave the church.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing that. As I say, vexed and angry, but also left with such hope. I can't tell you how many have come to me after baptism and said, we've never felt that welcome, or we've never felt like we belong. And now that our child is baptized here, we feel like we have a home and a community. It's so important because it's people's foundational and initial experience of their faith.
Certainly.
I think that's a beautiful place for us to take a little break and just to take that in. So thank you for sharing that. We're going to come back after the break, and we're going to talk specifically about the celebration of baptism itself and how pastors might think about preaching for baptism. Stay with us. Welcome back to Preach. We're speaking with Christina Mines, who is the Diocesan Director for Evangelization and Catechesis in the Hamilton Diocese in Ontario, Canada. Christina, before we took a break, we sort of set the landscape for baptism. Now I want us to look at what does baptism look like on the day of baptism, the concrete experience, and what have you heard really works and doesn't work for parents in terms of their liturgical experience, particularly the preaching? Maybe we can start by looking at the qualities of a good homily. What do you think is important to include in a homily about baptism?
Well, I think just in a very practical sense, particularly in infant and early childhood baptism, I think brevity is so important. Families come in with a sense of anxiety on baptism day. I've been at the doors to greet families in my own parish, and their shoulders can sometimes be up in their ears. Children could already have blowouts out of their beautiful white gowns and dresses, and siblings often can be a challenge. I think of my own children's baptisms, and past the first child, I couldn't tell you what was preached about. I'm sorry, I can't. And I love the presider that we had. It's a family friend who has journeyed with us through our whole life. And he married my husband and I, and he's baptized all three of my babies. But once there's other children in the mix, your time and your space is distracted. And so I think that the best encouragement that can happen at a baptism is to not necessarily speak to the parents. I think that happens in our preparatory work with families. I think that happens in our gentle accompaniment of them towards the waters. Let them just simply engage in the rituals that are about to be experienced both by parents, godparents, but by the child too. I think the best thing we can do is to speak to the congregation who bookends the family. They work around the family. They're there to emotionally and physically walk alongside this beautiful domestic church to grow this child in a life of faith and in a confidence of knowing Jesus. And so that provides them with a language of love that can be transmitted to the child throughout their whole entire lives. I think this involves knowing your audience, right? So I think about who came to our own children's baptism. My husband and I are both millennials, and we have millennial friends, and they are generous. They are loving towards our children, but they're not necessarily people who practice their faith. So to be able to provide a language of love, virtue, and generosity that speaks to the person of Jesus Christ without necessarily, trying to proselytize to the community who's at hand really helps equip them with a means to be able to nurture faith in the child and begin to ask questions of meaning and value of what they're experiencing in the world around them. And really, that's hope.
Yeah, I have two things, or maybe three things, that I usually start any baptism with. And this is even before, I've welcomed the parents and brought everybody in. I'm like, hi, I'm Ricardo. This is who I am. And I introduce myself. And then I say, first of all, I see many young children here. It is counterproductive for you and for me to try to contain them.
Yes.
Have an eye on them. Make sure they're not tugging at tablecloths and burning themselves on candles. But this should feel like their home. And, if they can't sit still because they're not of an age that they can do that, it's more distracting for you and for me to try to do that. So let them roam free and watch them. And then I also say, if you're here and you're sitting with a child on your lap, or you're an elderly person and you can't get up with every motion, it's okay to just remain seated or in whatever position you need to be. Let's be together for a few minutes.
Yeah.
And then I give a moment of silence and we begin the liturgy. But I think that gives people permission to say, okay, he, the pastor, is aware of our predicament and knows kind of what's going on here, has probably been in a family himself, and we can relax. This isn't to try to pat myself on the back. It's things that I've learned from what I've seen, from what I've heard. And I've heard so many parents say, we get into a church and we're nervous. We don't know what to do. We don't know what to say. Just a smile on your dial, right? A smile on your face as the pastor, as the deacon, as the hospitality minister does so much for this community.
Yeah.
That's bringing their child to be received into the church.
You put the humanity first, and Christ always did, right? Like he always fed people before he taught them, like there was a sense of awareness of who we are as human people and the need to belong and feel welcomed before anything is required of us. And I think that that's the challenge at baptism. Often when it comes to the parts that we need to pay attention to, or we need to engage with, or we need to respond to, is that it often, particularly for young people, can feel like a transactional experience, right? I'm here to give something to you so that you can give something to me, and then we'll carry on with our day and we'll stop inconveniencing one another. But to be able to meet each other in that place to say, I get it. You are very welcome. Now let's start. It gives them an opportunity to set all aside that they think you're judging them on.
I love that line about hope, because ultimately all preaching should proclaim hope. Sometimes, as I said this past weekend, it's the hard good news, but sometimes it really is just the good news, that leaves us feeling light and encouraged. How do you think preaching for baptism can be preaching hope, especially for the congregation, right? A community of lapsed Catholics, maybe only sacraments and Easter, Christmas Catholics, Catholics who come every week, and actually, increasingly, people who aren't Catholic at all, who have no faith at all, or who come from a different religious persuasion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it goes back to the understanding of what it means to be church. And I think it's an invitation of hope for each person who is surrounding this beautiful child in this moment of celebration, to be love for this child, but also for one another, and to witness Christ in small and big ways. One of my favorite lines, I read Cardinal Radcliffe's Meditations from the Synod, and he said, this whole process is really just a way for us to understand that we need each other. And often godparents and community members and loved ones of a family, when they're gathered together in baptism, they feel so out of their skin. They feel so much so that they don't participate. You see it at weddings too. Don't you, Ricardo? When I'm a music minister, and often I have to give the cues to everyone through the microphone of what needs to be said and done along the way.
Baptism.
Yeah. sit down now. It's okay. And so I think when we talk about hope, the hope of the church is that this generation of young families are invited and emboldened even to become more alive through the grace of the sacraments and through their relationship with this community. But to do that, just like you demonstrated so beautifully in your example of what you do at baptism, we need to meet them in their humanity. So I think in the terms of preaching, we don't sugarcoat it. This world is hard. To be family, to live as a domestic church today is difficult. We know you as young parents face a lot of imposter syndrome, right? And that's born from a lack of environment that nurtures family, a lack of environment that invites you to share and grow your faith. And often support can come at an arm's length or at a cost to you. There is no cost here. There is no price. We love you. We understand that you're on a journey. We just want to join you on that. And so how can we work together to grow in love and understanding of one another, and in the understanding that we need one another to be whole?
That is beautiful. And certainly what I'm trying to do when I'm saying or expounding on that this is my child, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased. It's so important for us to do that. What do you think we need to do, again, thinking about millennial parents, maybe people who don't have adequate catechetical formation, don't even know really what a sacrament is, let alone the symbols involved in sacraments? Do you think there is a role for theological explanation or kind of unpacking the sacrament in preaching?
I think if it's done in a way that is accessible, that could be helpful. I think the bounty of theological resource ought to come in the preparation personally. I think of my own husband, for example. We talk about this. There's a few people in our lovely Chancery Office family who talk about why they go to Mass. We talk about that often. Why do you go to Mass on Sunday? Despite everything that's happening in the world, despite everything that's happening in your family, why do you go? Why do you go to the table? And one of my dear friends here at the Chancery Office, he said to me, Christina, I go for hope and a host. And I thought of my own husband, and I thought, that's why he goes too. My husband doesn't have a degree in theology. He's an insurance broker, but he loves God. He loves his family, and he certainly loves his wife. And so he knows she'll give him a stare if he doesn't get up and go to Mass with us on a Sunday morning. But at the experience of our children's baptism, he wasn't there for a theological catechesis. He wasn't there to learn about the symbols or the signs and connect them to his relationship with God. He wanted to know that his child was loved and belonged and was accepted just as they are. That's why he was there. And I think that is the general population of people who are coming forward for baptism. They want to be able to take away manna for the desert. They want to be able to connect this moment of grace and celebration in their family to their daily living, so that when it is hard to find the hope, that anchor is still sound, right? That anchor is still deep, and we are able to draw from it to know that the family of God really does overcome all things. And the sacraments strengthen us for that work.
I think you've really helped us to think about the preaching moment, and I can't wait to hear what our preacher has in store for us in the next episode. But maybe let's look very briefly at what that preaching moment can set up for what comes next. What we often hear from priests, what I've said here myself, and really try to not say this because it is my responsibility as a pastor to ensure ongoing faith formation and to ensure that there's an ongoing relationship. But inevitably what we hear is, okay, I baptized these kids. We've had this wonderful celebratory experience once off. I'll never see these people again.
Right.
What is it that I can do as a pastor? And now I'm asking you, especially as a parent from your experience and experience maybe with friends of yours who are parents who don't have the same formation as you do. What is it that we can do as pastors to ensure that people have an experience that provokes transformation, conversion.
Yes.
Conversion of heart and mind and soul. Like, how can we preach for conversion? Not for proselytization, but for conversion.
Yeah. And I was just going to use that word too. So I'm glad we're on the same wavelength, Ricardo, or at least an invitation to ask further questions, to meet us again in conversation. And I think what can be preached is that baptism, and theologically we understand this, baptism begins our new life in God's family. That's the moment. And so no matter how far away parents or godparents may feel from that reality, the truth still stands that now you have been drawn deeply into the embrace of God's family. Even if you don't feel so for yourself, certainly you feel so for your child. This is the beginning of a wonderful adventure with the person of Jesus Christ. And how do you imagine this adventure growing and developing and expanding in your child's life as they grow and learn about the world and about God? And how can we help you do that? But this work can't end at the pulpit. Like, we have to be accountable for our families. And that means, like I said earlier, being really uncomfortable and doing the hard grunt work. Because I think particularly, and I think I speak for myself and my friends who are a part of this millennial generation, it can be easy to dismiss ourselves as valuable sometimes in the church. Even in our own diocese, we finished up last year, but we went through this consultation process. It was a synodal listening exercise around the diocese called Forward Together in Christ. And we interviewed a series of people on different priorities or goals in the diocese. And one of them was catechesis. But when we were talking about catechesis with families, young families particular, made it clear that both their children and the parents needed to see themselves in the life of the parish and feel seen and supported. And that may be as simple as at a baptism, having another young family who's recently gone through baptism being there and witness to that and introducing themselves after the liturgy, or dropping, their Instagram profile in the little card that the CWL gives with a miraculous medal at the end of the service with the certificate, or provides the family with a connection where we have a gathering of young families who've recently had children baptized every 6 months for a barbecue or a tea after Mass. This is where the rubber hits the road. I think if we're going to preach the theology of belonging, it needs to then be enacted with word and deed.
That's ultimately what it's about, and it just made me think, one of the ways that maybe as a pastor I can get away from, I'll never see these people again, is to think about how many times after I've baptized a family that I've never met, somebody has come up to me and said, "Oh, Father, can I have a conversation with you about X, Y, Z?" Or, "Oh, Father, my friend, you might remember I was in the congregation. I'd like to baptize my child now." And so there is an experience, I think, of conversion that happens that we just need to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
Christina, I want to thank you because this has been a fascinating window into baptism from your perspective as a diocesan catechetical director, but also as a parent and a millennial parent at that, thinking about how baptism transforms the experience of faith for you and your family. So thank you for giving us that time.
Thank you, Ricardo. It was lovely speaking with you.
Thanks for listening to Preach. My guest was Christina Mines. Maggie Van Dorn and I are the producers of this show, but we've got an amazing team behind us. Kevin Christopher Robles is in the studio helping with production. Frank Tucson is the wizard behind the music you're hearing, the sound engineering, and now our video editing too. Sebastian Gomes is our executive producer. Preach is made possible by the Compelling Preaching Initiative, a project of Lilly Endowment, Inc. If you love what you're hearing, remember, as always, please leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. It helps more listeners discover the show. You can also follow me on Instagram at RicDSSJ. That's RICDSSJ. And there you'll find some behind-the-scenes content about Preach and my other work here at American Media. I'm Ricardo da Silva. Until next time, keep preaching the good news.